By the autumn of 1944, the Jewish people in the Hungarian provinces have been ghettoized, deported, and murdered in one of the most rapid programs of mass murder in history. Now Jewish people in Budapest are the last survivors of the Holocaust in Hungary. After Miklós Horthy, regent of Hungary, finally intervened to halt the deportation trains back in July, Budapest's Jews held out hope that they will survive the war. But are these hopes in vain? Will Horthy be the savior of Hungary's last remaining Jews? I'm Spartacus Olsson. This is War Against Humanity, a series of World War II in real time. Before I answer that question, let's take a moment to look back at the story so far. After occupying the country in March, the Germans forced Horthy to appoint the pro-German Döme Stoyai as prime minister in return for retaining his throne and some of his country's sovereignty. As well as ensuring Hungary's continued adherence to the Axis cause, the Germans were also intent on destroying a Jewish population that had, until then, been largely protected from the Holocaust. Stoyai, along with other ultra-right pro-Nazi elements of the government and security services, cooperated with SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann's plan for mass murder. Beginning on May 15th, Eichmann and his allies rapidly ghettoized and then deported almost all of Hungary's Jewish population outside of Budapest by early July. There was little opposition to this process from the Hungarian state or church. The Jews in these provincial regions, some of them only recently annexed like Carpatho-Ruthenia and northern Transylvania, were largely unassimilated and often non-Hungarian speaking. But Budapest was different. The Jews here are some of the most assimilated in Europe. Until the German occupation, they lived in relative freedom compared to the rest of Axis Europe. Unable to put in place full ghettoization, the Hungarian authorities ordered the remaining 230,000 or so Jews to concentrate themselves in about 2,000 of the city's 36,000 residential buildings. Marked with a Star of David, these buildings were designated Yellow Star houses. New rules prohibited Jews from leaving home except between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m., and then only for shopping, cleaning, or medical treatment. Jews were prohibited from having guests over or even shouting from building to building. Eventually, the most pro-Nazi elements in the Hungarian government had enough of Horthy's relative moderacy. The Minister of the Interior, Andor János, and his State Secretary, László Endre and László Baki, both vocal anti-Semites, collaborated closely with Eichmann. On July 2nd, they acted unilaterally, flooding the city with gendarmes and scheduling ghettoization and deportation for July 10th. It was here that Horthy finally drew the line. He ordered the gendarmes back to the barracks, deployed the regular army to keep order, and dismissed the trio from their government posts. He halted any further Jewish deportations to Auschwitz on July 7th, and the last trains left on July 9th. Rather, the gendarme action was the beginning of a coup attempt by the Ultra to replace Horthy with Ferenc Szálasi, leader of the previously banned fascist Nyílás Keresztespárt, or Arrow Cross Party. It was this that drove Horthy to action, along with the growing intensity of international criticism from the Western Allies, neutral states, and the bombing of Budapest by the USAAF. Horthy's decision brought the Jews some time. An alliance of aid agents, Hungarian Jewish businessmen, and foreign diplomats used this pause in the murder machinery to continue saving as many Jews as possible. We saw in previous episodes that the Jewish lawyer, journalist, and leader of the Budapest Aid and Rescue Committee, Rezső Kastner, negotiated a deal with Eichmann. In return for about 5 million Swiss francs, about 1,700 Jews left Budapest on the so-called Kastner train back on June 30th. Other larger-scale efforts get underway over summer. The Swiss consul Karl Lutz has given diplomatic protection and an office to Miklós Moshe Kraus. Kraus is the executive secretary of the Budapest Palestine Office, an organization dedicated to the covert immigration of Jews to the British Mandate. After negotiations with the Hungarians and Germans, he manages to secure permission for the immigration of 7,800 Jews to Palestine. But Kraus and Lutz exploit an oversight in the wording to expand this quote. See, In keeping with the dehumanization of Jewish people, the agreement stipulates that 7,800 units may emigrate, not people. The two men interpret units as meaning family units and distribute more than 7,800 passes. By the time that office is up and running in July, Swedish businessman and diplomat Raoul Wallenberg arrives in Budapest. After discussions between the Swedish government and U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Wallenberg's mission is to provide relief and rescue to as many Jewish people as possible. He starts off on a small scale, providing Swedish protection to 650 eligible Budapesti Jews. But as we shall see, this is only the start of his efforts. There are promising signs for Budapest's Jews when Horthy intervenes to prevent a second attempt at deportation on August 25th and reshuffles his government. Horthy replaces Prime Minister Dömös Stolyai with General Géza Lakatos. Lakatos's government lightens the Jewish curfews during Rosh Hashanah on September 18th and 19th and Yom Kippur on September 27th. After striking a deal with the Jewish Council, Lakatos announces greater freedom of movement for Jews in return for enlisting at least 2,000 as rubble cleaners in Budapest. But after a brief period of light, the darkness soon returns. Part of Lakatos's briefing is to make an agreement with the Soviets. When Horthy announces the resulting armistice on October 15th, the Germans launch Operation Panzerfaust. It begins at about 11 a.m. when SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny kidnaps Horthy's son, Miklós Horthy Jr., a staunch anti-Nazi who was key in persuading his father to halt the deportations. After Horthy Sr.'s radio broadcast, Skorzeny leads a convoy of 4 King Tiger tanks up to the palace on Castle Hill and seizes the regent. The next day, Horthy is frog-marched back to the palace by the Waffen-SS and forced to sign an abdication document. In Horthy's place, the Germans install Ferenc Szálasi as head of state. Upon hearing Horthy's proclamation, the Jewish people of Budapest had been overjoyed. Believing the war to be over, some of them had even torn off their yellow badges and left the Yellow Star buildings. Those in the labor services downed their tools. But it's short-lived salvation. Szálasi recommits Hungary to the Axis cause, and most of the army, the gendarmerie, and the police all swing behind the new fascist leadership, who are passionate anti-Semites and firm believers in the same mythology of a worldwide Jewish conspiracy as the Nazis. Back in June 1943, Szálasi declared, "Plutocracy, Freemasonry, the liberal democracies, parliamentarianism, the gold standard, and Marxism are all but instruments in the hands of the Jews so that they can hang on to their power and control over the world." Immediately, the Aerocross begin vicious radio broadcasts against the Judeo-Bolshevik menace. On the streets, the young thugs of the party, the Nyilasok, are whipped up into a frenzied pogrom and murder several hundred Jewish people in one night. They commit similar atrocities against the few remaining Jews in the countryside. At Pustavom, just northwest of the town Székesfehérvár, the Nyilasok murder 216 Jewish members of the labor service. The Aerocross don't really have a fully formed plan to deal with the Jews, but they decide on a program of forced labor and ghettoization. By October 26, about 35,000 Jewish men and women have been press-ganged into labor companies to dig trenches and build fortifications on the outskirts of the capital. Deaths from exhaustion are routine as the already weakened victims work long hours on starvation rations and spend the cold autumn nights sleeping in the open. Others are killed by beatings and torture. After the Soviets launched their offensive on Budapest at the end of October, the Nyilasok withdraw the Jews from the front line and march them back in huge columns through Budapest to the western side of the Danube. As they cross the city's bridges, the Aerocross men entertain themselves by shooting straggling Jews and watching their bodies fall into the Danube. Things are even more hellish for anyone Jewish who the Aerocross consider useless for their military cause. Back on October 17th, the new fascist Minister of the Interior, Gábor Vajna, agreed with Eichmann to dispatch 50,000 Jews to labor in the Reich. These Jews are taken from their homes and imprisoned in barns, warehouses, and factories at transit hubs across the city in preparation for transfer to Germany. With sheer bravado and the assistance of sympathetic police officers, Karl Lutz and Raoul Wallenberg traveled to these staging areas, rescuing anyone holding Swiss or Swedish protective passes. The two men hand out as many additional passes as they can, but most of the victims cannot be saved and are dispatched on a 200-kilometer-long foot march towards Vienna. Thousands will die of exhaustion, starvation, and exposure during these 8-day Halal-Menetek death marches. The Arrow Cross will execute many others who become too weak to continue. It's entirely pointless from a labor perspective. Not only are the victims far too weak to work when they arrive in Austria, but the Hungarians have kept as many as possible of the fittest victims at home to dig trenches, as one Jewish council report puts it. According to reports received, thousands of Jews are being marched towards the border, the old, the sick, as well as the young children, in the scantiest attire, without rest and food, are thus marching with no time even for attending to their bodily needs. Great numbers are lying dead along the roads, unburied, and many commit suicide because of the terrible sufferings. One of those lying dead by the roadside is Miklós Horthy, shot for being unable to walk any further. In another life, Miklós was a teacher and a poet, and has continued scribbling down his work in the days before his murder. His last poem, sitting in his jacket pocket, records how this exercise in human misery ends for so many people. I fell beside him, and his corpse turned over, tight already as a snapping string, shot in the neck. And that's how you'll end too, I whispered to myself. Lie still, no moving, now patience, flowers into death. Then I could hear, Der springt noch auf! Above and very near, blood mixed with mud was drying on my ear. Back in Budapest, diplomatic efforts to save lives continue as the Soviets close in on the capital and the Arrow Cross regime grows ever harsher. By the time of the Arrow Cross coup on October 15th, Wallenberg has distributed Swedish protective passes to about 4,500 Jews. This rises to over 7,000 by the end of October and into November. A further 10,000 people hold forged documents. Wallenberg has crammed as many of these Jews into some 30 buildings that he has rented in Budapest. Funded by donations from Jewish Americans via the War Refugee Board, Wallenberg declares these Swedish houses to be under diplomatic protection. Foreign protection proves invaluable when the Szálasi government finally launches the full ghettoization of Budapest. In the hopes of achieving diplomatic recognition from the neutral states, Szálasi allows 15,600 Jews holding passes from Switzerland, Sweden, the Vatican, Portugal, and Spain to be transferred to what becomes known as the International Ghetto. That number will rise to 25,000 by the end of the war. Conditions here are abysmal, with people packed into apartment buildings designed to hold less than 4,000 people. Theoretically, they are protected from the Nyalasok, but the thugs still regularly raid the ghetto. They rob and kill or deport for labor those whose papers are lost or forged. For those without protection, the future is even bleaker. On November 29th, the Arrow Cross order all unprotected Jewish people to move into the so-called Big Ghetto, which is established in Budapest's Jewish quarters. The ghetto is crushingly overcrowded. By the end of the war, 70,000 Jews will be crammed into 162 Yellow Star buildings. The space is further limited because the Christian inhabitants of these buildings have nowhere to go themselves. According to Jewish Council calculations, even if all Christians moved out, there would be 4,725 rooms altogether, which is about 13 to 14 people per room. Food becomes scarcer and scarcer. By December 2nd, the Jewish Council records the ration allotted to Jews: 150 grams of bread, 40 grams of flour, 10 grams of cooking oil, and 30 grams of legumes. The Council determines that this totals 915 calories, close to starvation rations. Mass starvation is avoided only thanks to food smuggled in from the international ghetto, from Jewish people with exemptions, underground Zionist organizations, and the relief efforts of the neutral states. By December 9th, Szálasi, the so-called father of the nation, has fled the country. The Soviets and the Romanians will complete their encirclement of the city by December 26th, and Hitler will declare Budapest a fortress to be held until the last. The remaining Jewish people of Budapest, whether in the international ghetto, the Big Ghetto, or in hiding, are consigned to the misery of a 50-day siege, along with about 800,000 other civilians. Wallenberg, Lutz, and the others will continue their desperate work to save lives even as Eichmann makes his final plans to murder the remaining Jewish people in the city. I will cover that story as it unfolds and the additional horrors that Soviet occupation brings. But I can tell you now that at the end of the siege, there will be about 100,000 Jews left alive across the two ghettos, along with about 20,000 in hiding. Those survivors will be joined by about 20,000 returnees from deportation and about 5,000 survivors of the labor services. The rest of Budapest's Jewish people will have perished. Most will have been deported to Auschwitz and the gas chambers. But the Arrow Cross will also have murdered some 10,000 to 15,000 Jews and other Budapestis by the end of the war, many shot on the banks of the Danube. But back to my original question. Did Miklós Horthy save Budapest's Jews? After the war, with Hungary under the thumb of the Soviet Union, Hungarian conservative émigré circles will certainly peddle that narrative. Some people will continue to do so well into the 21st century. And while it may have been made largely for self-interest reasons, Horthy's decision to stop deportations in July 1944 undoubtedly thwarted Eichmann's plans for a rapid mass murder of Budapest's Jewish population. But to buy into this logic is to miss the bigger picture. The number of Jewish people in Hungary who survived the war will be about 250,000, less than one-third of the 825,000 Jewish people recorded as living within Hungary's borders in the 1941 census. Of the nearly 600,000 men, women, and children murdered in the Holocaust, the vast majority, more than 430,000, are killed between May 15th and July 9th, while Hungary was occupied but before Horthy was overthrown, and crucially, as we saw by Horthy's decision on July 7th, while he still had the power to intervene. Not only did it devastate Hungarian Jewry, but the scale and speed of that mass murder of the provincial Jews of Hungary will come to define the popular image of Auschwitz and the Holocaust. I'll leave you with some words written by historian of the Holocaust Dan Stone in 2023. Of the 1.1 million people murdered at Auschwitz, 1 million were Jews. 1 in 3 of them was from Hungary, and they arrived and were killed there in 56 days, between 15th of May and 9th of July. Were it not for the deportations in spring 1944, the most infamous Nazi death camp would have been dwarfed in terms of the numbers of its victims by Treblinka. The infamous images of Birkenau, the railway track running into the camp, the Jewish ramp, where selections for murder or for labor took place, in the photographs of the selection process from the so-called Auschwitz album, all come from the period of the Holocaust in Hungary. This huge and rapid deportation process would not have been possible without the role played by Hungarian gendarmes and police in rounding up and deporting the Jews. Today, when I'm recording this, it is the 4th day of Hanukkah 2023, and calls to revive these beastly times are echoing through the halls of campuses, in city streets, and on town squares. My heart sinks, my mind reels, and my soul refuses to accept that this is humanity. But it will be if we do not remember. Never forget.